Your father left a letter. The lawyer's words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled, and I watched my brother's face, that smug, self-satisfied expression he'd perfected over 46 years, begin its slow-motion collapse. To understand the look on his face, you have to understand the 18 years that led to it. My father died on a Wednesday. I got the call at 3:47 a.m. while I was in a secure conference room at the Hoover Building, reviewing surveillance protocols for a joint task force operation spanning 6 states. My phone, the personal one, not the encrypted one, buzzed against the table with my mother's number. I knew before I answered. You develop an instinct for these things, the timing, the hour, the way tragedy announces itself through the rhythm of a phone's vibration. Leanne, my mother said, her voice already threaded with that particular exhaustion that comes from hours of hospital vigils. It's your father. I'll be there in 4 hours, I said. You don't have to. I know you're busy with work. Mom, 4 hours. I ended the call, informed my deputy that I needed to take emergency leave, and was in my car within 20 minutes. The drive from D.C. to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, took exactly 3 hours and 42 minutes at that time of morning. I made it with 18 minutes to spare. My father, Gerald Mercer, proprietor of Mercer Agricultural Supply, pillar of the Lancaster County business community, and man who'd spent my entire adult life convinced I'd wasted mine, was already gone by the time I arrived. The hospital room was full of the efficient sadness of medical staff who'd done everything they could, and the hovering awkwardness of family members who didn't know what to do next. My mother, Patricia, sat in the chair by the window, holding my father's hand, even though there was no longer anyone to hold back. My brother, Robert, stood by the door with his wife, Chrissy, already on his phone, already managing, already taking control, because that's what Robert did, took control, managed situations, established dominance. He looked up when I entered, and I saw the calculation flicker across his face, that brief assessment he always made when I appeared, measuring whether I posed any threat to whatever narrative he was currently constructing. Leanne, he said, with that particular tone of surprise that suggested he hadn't actually expected me to show up, you made it. I said I would. Well, you know how it is with your schedule. We never really know where you are or what you're doing. He said it lightly, almost teasingly, but there was an edge underneath. There was always an edge underneath. I ignored it. Walked past him to my mother, who stood when she saw me and collapsed into my arms with the kind of grief that only comes from losing someone you've spent 47 years building a life with. He went peacefully, she said into my shoulder. The doctor said it was quick. His heart just stopped. I held her, let her cry, made the appropriate sounds of comfort and support, and watched Robert over her shoulder, already mentally organizing the funeral, the estate, the distribution of assets and responsibilities. Already, I could see him parceling out the future, deciding who got what, who was capable of handling what. Already deciding that I, as usual, would be found wanting. Here's what you need to understand about my brother Robert. He's not a bad person. He's just a person who needs to win, constantly, visibly, at everything. When we were kids, he was the one who kept score at family game nights and got genuinely upset when he lost. He was the one who turned every childhood competition, who could run faster, who could throw farther, who got better grades, into a referendum on his worth as a human being. And when I stopped competing, he decided that meant he'd won. I'd gone to Penn State for college. Robert had gone to Wharton. I'd joined the FBI right out of school. Robert had joined our father's business. I'd spent 18 years moving up through various field offices and headquarters assignments. Robert had spent 18 years expanding Mercer Agricultural Supply from a regional operation to a multi-state distribution network worth, at last estimate, somewhere north of $15 million. By every metric that mattered to our family, by every metric that mattered to Robert, he had succeeded and I had persisted. He owned a 4,000-square-foot house in Lancaster's historic district. I rented a one-bedroom apartment in Alexandria, Virginia. He drove a BMW X5. I drove a 7-year-old Honda Civic. He had 2 kids in private school. I had a cat named Hoover, who I barely saw because I worked 70-hour weeks. He belonged to the country club, served on the boards of local charities, hosted elaborate dinner parties where he networked with other successful business owners. I worked in an office building in DC that I couldn't talk about, doing work I couldn't describe, for a salary that I never mentioned. And because I never mentioned it, because I couldn't talk about most of what I did, because I lived modestly and came home rarely and seemed to have no visible markers of success, Robert had concluded, with the serene confidence of someone who'd never questioned his assumptions, that I'd failed. Not catastrophically, not in a way that required intervention or pity. Just quietly, persistently. In the way that people fail when they make safe choices. When they settle for good enough. When they lack the ambition or talent to achieve anything remarkable. He'd never said this explicitly, of course. He didn't have to. It was in the way he asked about my little job with the government. It was in the way he'd offer to help out if I ever needed money, delivered with that particular kindness that's really just condescension in a softer package. It was in the way he'd introduce me at family gatherings. This is my sister Leanne. She works for the FBI, field agent stuff, very civil service. Civil service. As if I were a DMV clerk with a badge. And I'd let him believe it. For 18 years, I'd let him believe it. Partly because most of what I actually did was classified and couldn't be discussed. Partly because explaining my real position would have required revealing information that posed operational security risks. But mostly, and this was the part one, only admitted to myself late at night, after long days of high-stakes decisions, because there was something darkly entertaining about being consistently underestimated by someone who thought he was smarter than you. Robert believed he'd won our childhood competition, and I decided to let him keep believing it right up until the moment it mattered. The funeral was on Saturday. Classic Lancaster County affair, packed church, earnest pastor, hymns that everyone knew the words to, casseroles multiplying in my mother's kitchen like they were reproducing asexually. I wore a simple black dress. Robert wore an expensive suit and the expression of a man bearing up under the weight of his responsibilities with admirable stoicism. People approached him constantly, offering condolences, asking if there was anything they could do, treating him as the obvious patriarch of the Mercer family now that our father was gone. And he handled it beautifully, graciously accepting sympathy, thanking people for their support, making subtle reference to how he'd have to take care of everything now and make sure mom's provided for and handle the business affairs. I stood near the back of the receiving line, shaking hands, accepting hugs, listening to variations of the same conversation. And you're the daughter who lives in Washington? Yes. What do you do there? I work for the FBI. Oh, how interesting. Is it like in the movies? Not exactly. Well, it's good you have steady work. Government jobs are so secure, aren't they? Very secure. And then they'd move on, their curiosity satisfied, their assumptions confirmed. Robert was the successful one, and I was the one with the steady government job. At the reception afterward, held at the country club where Robert was a member, I found myself cornered by my Uncle Frank, my father's younger brother, who'd always resented that his older sibling had been more successful in business. Your brother's really stepping up, Frank said, gesturing toward Robert, who was holding court near the buffet table. Taking over the business, taking care of your mother, that's real responsibility. It is, I agreed. You're lucky you don't have to deal with all that. The business stuff, the financial complications. You can just focus on your little job and let Robert handle the hard parts. My little job. I smiled. I am very lucky. Frank nodded, satisfied that I understood my place in the family hierarchy, and wandered off to get more brisket. Across the room, Robert caught my eye and raised his glass slightly, a small gesture of acknowledgement, or perhaps victory. I raised mine back. Let him have this moment, I thought. Let him enjoy it. The will reading was scheduled for Thursday, exactly 1 week after my father's death. Our father's attorney, Harold DeWitt, had been handling the family's legal affairs for 30 years. He was a man who wore bow ties unironically and kept hard candies in a dish on his desk, and spoke with the measured formality of someone who'd grown up when lawyers were still considered pillars of society rather than punchlines to jokes. The meeting was set for 10 a.m. at his office on Queen Street, in one of those preserved historic buildings that Lancaster loved to maintain as a reminder of more gracious times. I'd taken the entire week off, one of the advantages of accumulated leave when you never took vacations. Officially, I was on bereavement leave. Unofficially, my deputy was handling the daily operations of my division with the ruthless competence that had made me select her for the position in the first place. I arrived at 9:52 a.m., parking my Honda in the public lot and walking 2 blocks to DeWitt's office. Robert's BMW was already there, parked in front of the building in a spot that was technically a loading zone, but that Robert clearly felt entitled to occupy. Inside, the office smelled like old wood and older money. The receptionist, a woman in her 60s who'd probably been working there since the Carter administration, smiled warmly and directed me to the conference room. My mother was already seated, looking smaller than she had a week ago, as if grief had physically diminished her. Chrissy, Robert's wife, sat beside her, wearing what I'd come to think of as her supportive family member outfit. Tasteful, expensive, carefully calibrated to project both compassion and success. And Robert, of course, seated at the head of the table, as if he'd already assumed ownership of it. He looked up when I entered, and I saw that flicker of surprise again, that he'd expected me to be late, or to not show up, or to otherwise confirm his belief that I wasn't quite reliable enough for important family matters. "Leanne," he said. "Good, you're here. I was just telling Mom that we should keep this simple. No need to drag things out or make it complicated." I took a seat across from him. "I'm sure Harold will handle it appropriately." Of course. I just mean, well, you know how these things can go. People getting emotional about material possessions, fighting over stuff that doesn't really matter. I want us to stay above that." What he meant was, I've already decided how everything should be divided, and I expect you to accept it gracefully. Harold DeWitt entered then, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing a bow tie that suggested he'd gotten dressed in the dark. He greeted us with appropriate solemnity, offered his condolences once more, and settled into his chair with the air of a man about to perform a familiar ritual. "Thank you all for coming," he said, opening the portfolio. "I know this is a difficult time, and I'll try to make this as straightforward as possible." Gerald was very clear about his wishes, and I believe this process will be relatively simple. He pulled out the will, several pages of legal text, and put on his reading glasses. "The last will and testament of Gerald Robert Mercer," he began, and launched into the standard legal language that wills always begin with. Sound mind, disposing of property, revoking previous wills. I listened with half my attention, the other half occupied with watching Robert's face. He was leaning forward slightly, fingers steepled, wearing an expression of appropriate seriousness that didn't quite hide his anticipation. He knew what was coming, or thought he did. Our father had built a substantial estate over his lifetime, the business valued conservatively at $15 million. The house in Lancaster, worth maybe $700,000. The vacation property in the Poconos, another $400,000. Various investments, savings accounts, retirement funds. All told, we were looking at an estate worth approximately $17 million, give or take. By anyone's standards, a significant inheritance. By Robert's standards, validation. Harold continued reading through the specific bequests, certain items to certain people, donations to specific charities, practical matters about debt and taxes. And then he got to the main distribution. To my wife, Patricia Ann Mercer, I leave the family home and all its contents, along with a trust fund sufficient to provide her with an annual income of $200,000 for the remainder of her life. My mother nodded, unsurprised. They discussed this, clearly. Harold continued, "The remaining assets of my estate, including Mercer Agricultural Supply and all associated holdings, investment accounts, and properties, are to be divided as follows." Robert shifted forward another inch. "Split equally between my 2 children, Robert Gerald Mercer and Leanne Patricia Mercer." There was a beat of silence. Robert blinked. "I'm sorry, equally?" Harold looked up from the document. "Yes, that's correct. 50% to each child." But, Robert glanced at Chrissy, then at our mother, then back at Harold. I run the business. I've been running it for 15 years. I've grown it from... Your father was very clear on this point, Harold said gently. Equal distribution. I watched Robert process this. Watched the mental calculations happening behind his eyes. Half of 15 million was still substantial, of course. Still life-changing money. Still more than most people would see in their lifetimes. But it wasn't the validation he'd expected. It wasn't the acknowledgement that he'd been the successful one, the responsible one, the one who'd earned the lion's share through his dedication to the family business. It was just equality, which, to Robert, felt like losing. He'd composed himself by the time Harold finished reading the remaining provisions. Technical details about execution, trustee appointments, standard legal protections. Well, Robert said finally, voice carefully neutral, that's very generous of Dad. Of course, I imagine there are some practical considerations about how to actually split a business that's actively operating. We can discuss that, Harold said. Your father suggested several possible structures: buyout arrangements, partnership agreements, gradual transition plans. Right. Robert drummed his fingers on the table. We should probably meet separately to discuss options. I don't want to bore everyone with business details. What he meant was, I need to figure out how to get control of this without looking like I'm trying to cheat my sister. My mother had started to stand, clearly ready to leave, when Robert turned to me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm glad this worked out fairly, he said, though honestly, I'm not sure what you'll do with your share. I mean, the business half doesn't really make sense for you. You're not involved in operations, you don't know the industry. Maybe we can work out an arrangement where I buy you out over time, give you some steady income from it. You could probably use the money, right? And there it was. The casual assumption, the gentle condescension, the implication that my share was really just a charitable gift from our father, an equal split on paper that would naturally resolve into Robert taking control because that's what made sense. Chrissy chimed in, her voice honey-sweet with false sympathy. It must be hard, living on a government salary in D.C. Everything's so expensive there. It is expensive, I agreed. So I'm sure you'd appreciate the cash flow, Robert continued. We could structure it so you get regular payments, maybe $50,000 a year. That would probably be more than your current salary, right? He said it kindly, like he was doing me a favor. $50,000 a year. For half of a $15 million business. I was about to respond with what I wasn't entirely sure when Robert's expression shifted into something that looked almost like pity. Look, I'm not trying to be presumptuous. I know this is all overwhelming. Money stuff, business stuff. It's not really your world. But I want you to know I'll take care of you. That's what family does. He leaned back, expansive now, generous. I'll get the lake house and the investment portfolio. And maybe Dad left you some unwanted furniture, but if not, I'll make sure to give you this junk from my new house. The words hung in the air. My mother looked uncomfortable. Chrissy was nodding along, as if Robert had just said something wise and compassionate. And Harold DeWitt, who'd been quietly organizing his papers, stopped moving. I'm sorry, Harold said slowly. I should clarify something. Robert turned to him, still wearing that beneficent expression. What's that? Your father left a letter, separate from the will. He asked me to read it after the distribution details were complete. Harold reached into his portfolio and pulled out an envelope, my father's handwriting visible on the front. He was quite specific that this should be shared with the family. A letter? My mother leaned forward. He didn't tell me about a letter. He wrote it about 6 months ago, Harold said, around the time he updated his will. 6 months ago. Right after the last time I'd visited, when I'd had dinner with my parents and Robert had spent the entire meal explaining, with exaggerated patience, how business strategy worked, as if I were a child who needed simple concepts explained in small words. Harold opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the letter inside. He asked me to read this aloud, Harold said, and then cleared his throat. To my children, he began, reading my father's words in a voice that made them feel suddenly painfully present. I know you'll have questions about how I've chosen to divide my estate. Robert, I know you expected more. You've put your life into the business, and I want you to know how proud I am of what you've built. Robert's expression softened slightly, vindication creeping into his features. "But I need you to understand something," Harold continued. "The equal split isn't charity, it's not sentimentality, it's mathematics." Robert's expression froze. "Split everything equally," Harold read, my father's voice somehow carrying through the words. "My daughter's federal salary dwarfs the family business." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of the sound of a worldview collapsing. Robert stared at Harold as if the words were in a foreign language he was struggling to translate. "I don't," he started. "What does that mean?" Harold looked up from the letter, then at me, and I saw understanding dawn in his eyes. He'd known my father for 30 years. He'd handled all the family's legal affairs. But he'd never known what I actually did, because my father had never told him. Because I'd asked my father not to tell anyone. "Perhaps," Harold said carefully, "Leanne can explain." Every eye in the room turned to me. My mother, confused and still grieving. Chrissy, wearing an expression of polite bewilderment. Harold, suddenly very interested in the answer to a question he hadn't known to ask. And Robert, my brother, who'd spent 18 years believing he'd won, looking at me like I was a stranger who'd just walked into his house uninvited. "Leanne," he said, "what is he talking about?" I'd played this moment in my mind before, imagined various scenarios where the truth might come out, prepared different responses for different contexts. But I'd never imagined it quite like this. Sitting in a lawyer's office, watching my brother's certainty crumble, reading the words my father had left behind like a final gift. "I'm not a field agent, Robert," I said quietly. "Then what?" "I'm an assistant director at the FBI." The words came out flat, factual. "I run the Criminal Investigative Division. I have approximately 2,000 people under my command. My annual salary is $187,000, plus performance bonuses that vary depending on various classified factors." The silence was absolute. "Assistant director," Robert repeated slowly. "One of 9 at the FBI," I confirmed. "I report directly to the deputy director." "But you said you were a field agent." "I never said that. You assumed that. I just never corrected you." Chrissy had gone pale. 2,000 people? "Give or take, depending on active task force assignments." "But," Robert was struggling, visibly struggling, "your apartment, your car, you live like someone who doesn't need to prove anything through material possessions?" I suggested. "Yes, I do." My mother had covered her mouth with one hand. "Did your father know?" "Of course he knew. He was incredibly proud." I felt my throat tighten. He just respected my request not to talk about it, for security reasons mostly, but also because... I looked at Robert. Because I asked him to let me handle it my own way. Quote, Harold had set down the letter and was watching this exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing a car crash in slow motion. "There's more," he said quietly, indicating the letter. "Your father wrote several more paragraphs." "Read it," I said. Harold picked up the letter again, found his place, and continued. "Robert, your sister has dedicated her life to serving this country at a level that most people never see. She works 70-hour weeks. She manages complex investigations involving national security. She's briefed presidents, plural. She can't talk about most of what she does, and she's chosen to live modestly because her work demands discretion and humility." Robert had slumped back in his chair, face slack. "I've watched you dismiss her achievements for years," Harold read. "And I've watched her let you because she's secure enough in her success that she doesn't need you to validate it. But I want you to know, I've always known the truth. And I'm splitting my estate equally, not because you both contributed equally to my business, but because you both built lives worthy of equal respect." Harold's voice had gone soft. He cleared his throat, continued. "Leanne, I know you didn't need this money. I know your salary and benefits and eventual pension mean you're more financially secure than most people in Lancaster County. But I wanted you to have half of what I built because you're my daughter, and because I'm proud of you, and because I never got to say that as much as I should have." He looked up. "That's where the letter ends. He signed it and dated it 6 months ago." The conference room existed in its own pocket of suspended time. My mother was crying quietly, tears running down her face, grieving the husband who'd left one final message of love. Chrissy was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time, recalculating 18 years of assumptions. Harold was carefully refolding the letter, his movements precise and slow, giving everyone time to process. And Robert? Robert looked like a man who just discovered that the map he'd been following his entire life had been oriented wrong. That north had been south all along, that every landmark he'd used to navigate had been misidentified. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked finally, voice hoarse. "Would you have believed me?" I asked gently. "If I'd told you 5 years ago that I was an assistant director, would you have taken me seriously? Or would you have assumed I was exaggerating, or that it was some minor administrative title that sounded impressive but didn't mean anything?" He opened his mouth, closed it, because we both knew the answer. "And honestly," I continued, "I didn't need you to know. My career wasn't about proving anything to you. It was about the work, about doing something that mattered. But all those years, all those comments about your little job, were you trying to make yourself feel better about your own choices?" I said. "Not cruelly, just factually, and I let you, because it didn't cost me anything." "It cost you my respect," he said quietly. "No," I corrected. "It revealed that your respect was conditional on me fitting into your definition of success. That's different." Chrissy made a small sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a sob. Robert looked at Harold. "The estate, the business, is exactly as your father specified," Harold said. "Split equally. You can work out the operational details however you choose, but the ownership is 50-50. Robert nodded mechanically, his brain still processing, still trying to reorganize reality around this new information. I stood up slowly. "I need some air." No one tried to stop me. I walked out of the conference room, through the reception area, out onto Queen Street where the sun was shining and people were going about their normal Thursday routines, unaware that, in the office behind me, a family's entire understanding of itself had just been rewritten. My phone buzzed, the encrypted one. A message from my deputy, SCOTUS, just ruled on the surveillance case. "We need your approval on next steps." I looked at the message, at the normalcy of my actual life, the world where I made decisions that affected national security, and no one cared what kind of car I drove or whether I belonged to a country club. I texted back, "Give me 30 minutes, I'll call from secure line." Another buzz, my personal phone this time, my mother. "Can we talk? I think I need to understand who my daughter really is." I smiled despite myself, typed back, "Yes, but maybe not today. Let's have dinner next week, just us." One more buzz, "Robert." "I'm sorry." Just those 2 words. I looked at them for a long moment, considering my response. Finally, I typed, "I know, we'll figure out the business stuff. Not today." I put both phones away and stood there on Queen Street, in the town where I'd grown up, where everyone had always assumed they knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of. And I realized something. The reveal wasn't the revenge. The revenge had been the 18 years before it, 18 years of watching Robert perform his success, of letting him believe he'd won, of knowing the whole time that I was operating at a level he couldn't even conceptualize. The revenge had been the quiet satisfaction of building something extraordinary while everyone around me looked for the wrong markers of achievement. The revenge had been my father's letter, written 6 months ago by a man who'd always known the truth, who'd watched his son swagger and his daughter serve, and who'd decided to leave one final message about what actually mattered. The revenge had been Robert's face when he realized that the sister he'd been condescending to for 18 years outranked, out-earned, and out-achieved him in ways that made his $15 million business look like a lemonade stand. But more than that, and this was the part that made me smile as I stood there in the Lancaster sunshine, the revenge was that I genuinely didn't need it. I'd built a life that mattered. I'd served my country at the highest levels. I'd made decisions that saved lives and protected freedoms and upheld justice in ways that would never make headlines, but that kept the machinery of democracy functioning. And whether my family knew it or not, whether they respected it or not, whether they ever understood it or not, it had always been enough. The inheritance wasn't validation, it was just money. The letter wasn't vindication, it was just love. And the look on Robert's face wasn't satisfaction. It was just the natural consequence of spending 18 years making assumptions he'd never bothered to test. I walked back into Harold's office. They were still sitting there, frozen in various poses of shell shock and reassessment. "Harold," I said, "can you send me the business documents? I'll review them and get back to you about the ownership structure. Robert, we can meet next week to discuss operational details. Mom, let's have dinner Tuesday. And everyone," I looked at each of them in turn. "Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. Dad split his estate equally. That's good, that's fair. The rest is just details." I left before anyone could respond. Walked to my 7-year-old Honda Civic, got in, and drove back to Alexandria, where I had actual work to do. Where 2,000 people were depending on me to make the right decisions. Where the machinery of justice needed someone to keep it running, and where I'd chosen to dedicate my life to doing exactly that. Where I'd been successful all along, even when no one was watching. Especially when no one was watching. That, I thought, as I merged onto I-95 and pointed the car south, was the real victory. Not the reveal, not the reversal, not the look on Robert's face. But the 18 years before it, when I'd known my own worth and let